Sam, how are you doing?
Hi, good.
It's so good to see you. I hope you're doing all right, Dimitri, and it's all good, Mr. Flores. I hope you're
Yeah.
doing all right. And Sam, that's great that you're doing that accountability group with Other Life. Didn't you do one with
Oh yeah.
Jockin? That's really wonderful.
Yeah, in the first quarter of 2023, well, Thomas and I have still been meeting, but we were partners for the accountability circle. We're just trying to like line it up with indie thinkers this time.
Very nice. Well, that is wonderful. That's a wonderful thing to do. So excellent on that. And Mr. Flores, I hope you're doing well today, sir. I appreciate all the work you're doing on the conception of time with Heidegger and so forth and so on. So that's really fascinating. I hope you're well today.
Oh yeah, I'm well. I'm happy that I'm able to make it today. It's one of these days where we got off work really early, and so I have a 4-day weekend. As
Nice.
far as like the Heidegger stuff, I did do like the exegetical for like chapter 2, but I haven't posted it yet because now I'm back on like the Lacanian grind, and I'm going to be participating in the Cree course with Cadell and Dimitri, so I'm excited for that. I
Oh,
actually posted up a video recently fleshing out some concepts on handling negativity and lack in psychoanalysis, clinically speaking, because like I mean we're ultimately dealing with lack and how to handle it, and how lack and trauma are constitutive of subjectivity, and it's not
mm,
like something that happens within like our circumstances, like the way like someone like Gabor Mate or like therapism or like therapy culture would like to like say it's like, oh, we could be whole again, or like we were whole and then like something happened and then it's all about healing so you become like an individual person again. It's like, no, that's not how it is. Like we're always already split from within ourselves. And so like pretty much the video is talking about I talk about in this video essay the clinical structures of neurosis, psychosis, and perversion, and the cause of them, according to Bruce Fink in his clinical introduction, are going to be the defense mechanisms that create the unconscious. So, like for the neurotic, it's repression that drives the unconscious, and like for instance, I focus in on distinguishing repression from negation,
mm.
Verneinung, and I quote a lot from Zupanchik's essay on Verneinung and the importance of negativity in Freud, and then Verwerfung, which is foreclosure, which is the foreclosure of the unconscious, and the master signifier in the psychotic. Pretty much talking about how the psychotic really much does not have language in the way that the neurotic structure does, so they don't have metaphor, don't have metonymy. And then the last one is going to be on disavowal, which is going to be what the pervert is driven by, because
Mm.
they are pretty much the inverse of the neurotic. They go through castration as well, but they try to disavow it, and the way they do so is through, well, for the sadist pervert, they are pretty much and I'm coming to learn this, like uh they encounter anxiety rather than try to avoid it by constructing themselves as the fantasy. Like they are imbued by fantasy, and they believe that they have the object cause of desire, and that the anxiety that comes with that fuels it. And so they inflict castration on the other by becoming the other for the other. So in later Lacan, his seminar 16, he'll say another for another. The problem is not that there is no big other or that the other is lacking. It's the problem that the fundamental fantasy is that we want to be the other for the other. And so that's the disavowal that the pervert believes. It's like they know that they lack. They know
Mm.
that the mother lacks. They know that the mother does not have a penis. Nevertheless, they still believe so, and that they could fulfill the maternal phallus by becoming that container for the split container.
Mm.
So that's pretty much what I focus on in the entire essay. Mainly, like the first part is just an elaboration on Verneinung and talking about how the failures of repression, slips of the tongue, and negation. Like, for instance, in I think it's the Wolfman where he's like, "I had a dream about a woman, but I can assure you that it was not my mother." So, like, that's the example of like Verneinung, like this affirmation that needs to be negated. Coffee without cream. I don't have cream, but I can give you coffee without milk. So that's what I'm working on right now.
Well, Mr. Flores, I'm always impressed with how you can go into detail on these projects and maintain the nuance of the language and present it so well. That's quite a skill, and I salute you in that undertaking. I'm very glad you will be taking the class with Dimitri, and I think Mr. Stanley will also be taking it, and everyone should take it over at Philosophy Portal with Cadell Last. So everyone, and Chiton, good to see you, Mr. Luber, and Javier. Why did you move the cat? The cat butt is fantastic for videos. I don't know why you put it down or different things like that. Come on, man. You know, it's really funny. I've been thinking a lot about, so everything you just described, if I were to speak very generally and say kind of encountering with lack or different strategies of how to deal with lack, like, you know, the pervert has one strategy, different people have other strategies and different things. It's very interesting because when I look at someone like, I'll dare say his name, Noam Chomsky, where he's kind of like, oh, you know, frickin' Lacan is just a charlatan. There's a lot of people that feel that way, right? It's very interesting that a question sort of arises. Why do some people feel like it's just a charlatan and it has no use, and other people know that it's like utterly important, right? Well, one of the things I would wager is that a lot of people that understand psychoanalysis is important are people of whom themselves have encountered lack, right? Or had some sort of collapse of their idols, as Walker Percy would say, and then you actually had some sort of deflation occur where you look back on yourself and go, oh, wow, I have these neuroses. So something happens in your life that it's almost like, I always make this example because I love it so much, at the end of the autobiography, and then I'll pass it to Dmitri with Nabokov, where he talks about one of those pictures. It's a big picture. It's made up of all these small pictures. And one day you see the big picture, and then it's like you can never not see the big picture, right? It's like it's always there in one of those kind of optical illusions. It's like find the sailor, and then once you see it, you can't unsee it, right? So a question sort of emerges on what makes people see the value of psychoanalysis or the need to encounter lack. Maybe a lot of people, it's a failed relationship. Maybe it's they get the career that they thought would make them happy and then it doesn't. Maybe it becomes like the misinterpretations that happen in relationships, et cetera, so forth, while other people don't. And this is what Michelle and I were actually talking about last night. What if, interesting enough, one of the problems now is you don't tend to encounter lack until 20 years, 30 years, or 40 years in your life when you're really invested in different things, right? And that's why it can be super traumatic. What if in children encountering AI early on in life will make them realize that if you can just tell the AI to create the video game you always wanted and it doesn't make you happy, they'll encounter lack sooner? Or what if you encounter this AI that makes you realize that there's something artificial from you that can do anything you want? And it's almost like I wonder if AI is going to help people encounter lack earlier in life so that they can like accept its reality without it being super traumatic, and therefore they're more likely to integrate with it in realistic ways or in healthy ways. Whereas now what ends up happening is you don't tend to find out about the hard, the difficulty of lack until, 30 years of investing in a career or all this time in making a movie, and then you do and you're like, oh, it's just another movie. And now you've had 30 years of investment and it's very difficult to recover from that. One of the things I wonder is if, in fact, AI will actually make the existence of lack clearer to people, for people earlier on, and then they'll be more open to all of the psychoanalytical thought, and then it will become clear on why that's important to think through and to deal with. So I'm wondering if it's almost like a decentralization of encounters with lack or a less concentration earlier on that might result in healthier responses to it. Because like if you encounter it when you're 30, you've got 30 years of building up in an alternative identity or an alternative sense of self that makes it more difficult to integrate with lack and more tempting to just deny it. And I wonder if actually AI could help people encounter it early on in life so that it just becomes a reality that they know they have to deal with, as opposed to something that's more tempting to deny. That's just an open question. We don't have to talk about that, but it's funny that what Mr. Flores was saying, because it's kind of like what Michelle and I were talking about. But let me pass it to Dmitri, then Miss Willem, and then Mr. Rivera. Dmitri, it's good to see you. I'm glad you're not at work. Amen. And I like the background of the trees. It's beautiful.
Yeah, thanks. I actually just came from work and decided the weather's super nice, so I just needed to clear my mind and yeah, go into the park. I don't know the answer to your question. I think it's a really difficult question. I think it would immediately entail the question of mass psychosis as well, because Zizek has kind of written about this angle of the encounter with AI in regards to lack and ChatGPT as well. However, I'm very interested in this idea of like, okay, why do people reject psychoanalysis? Why are they interested in it? And if you take, let's say, the genesis of Greek philosophy, it seems to be rooted, like, okay, going beyond the pre-Socratics in the Eleusinian mysteries. Plato will go on and on about in all the dialogues about the Eleusinian mysteries. And there is a philosopher, I don't know his name, unfortunately, I forgot it, but he talks about that. Actually, he makes the argument that Greek culture at that point had the most advanced psychedelic culture in the world. So of course, psychedelic cultures rise up in the East as well as in Latin America. He says, well, it was also present in Greece, and it was actually present to such an extent that they developed it notionally too. And this is where they get the notion of the one and things like this. Now, to what extent this is true, I have no idea. I don't even know if we can know in our lifetimes if this is actually true or not, or if we will ever know. But it's an interesting idea to consider. And we don't even have to take the word psychedelic as in a literal chemical substance that has psychedelic effects. But they were definitely doing something to the extent of what we perhaps can relate to, psychedelic spirituality or tantric spirituality, something that has had transformative personal impacts by means of initiation that involved, Plato will write about this in the Phaedrus, I believe, or the Seventh Letter, I'm not sure anymore, about mania, about craziness, and how actually for Plato philosophy is not this academic thing, right? It's a way of life. And I'd have actually to go back and reread to really substantiate my argument. But there's something happening there for sure. And if you go further into the lineage of philosophy, it seems like philosophers, like the philosophers we remember, are always those guys who have been like forcefully pushed out or had to forcefully unplug themselves from whatever was happening. Now, this is not always the case. For example, this is not the case with someone like perhaps a Hegel, who was a university teacher. But for example, Zizek will actually talk about this, that in the time of Nietzsche, there was actually a huge movement of neo-Kantians, and they didn't take Nietzsche serious at all. They were like, what the heck is this like overly romantic guy talking about? And now everyone remembers Nietzsche and doesn't know about those neo-Kantians. Now, Zizek is also Freud obviously is a phenomenon like this. He was scientific, he had a scientific way of thinking. He's very humble in his writings, I believe. But he wasn't accepted by the scientific community back in his time. Now, Lacan had the same kind of problem with the ossified organization of psychoanalysis. He deviated from that line with with the way he did his clinics. It wasn't just like an hour. You would like stop it at certain moments when something was said. And he created his own organization. Eventually, he even had to dissolve that. And yeah, like Zizek has been pushed out. He's not recognized by academia. And this is so important because, I mean, this is the reason why we, whoever be, we are all right here, are here. Because we don't fit into the general systems that have been developed to cultivate that intellectual thought, which would be academia, right? Like Daniel Garner, for example, you're probably one of the most productive philosophers on earth right now. You write so much and you read so much, and it's so incredible how much articles and podcasts and how many people you talk with and write and mention all the time, and you're not recognized by them. You're not recognized by academia, and maybe you will never be, but you keep doing your own thing, and like because whatever happened like concretely in your life, you've been kind of pushed out in a way. So you had to create your own thing, which is OG Rose, right? And I feel this with my project. Like I don't fit in. I've never finished high school. I just have to create my own thing. And I know Big Sig, you do that the same kind of work with under 30 underground. So I think it's fantastic that this is developing. And Zizek, like in the Fragile Absolute, which is a fantastic book, he will actually kind of foreshadow this happening. He will say that people the importance of what he calls unplugging, and that basically you become an outcast, and he says there has to be a community of outcasts. And what's so wonderful about the internet is that if the net is not mandatory at all, like university lectures and university papers are mandatory. When I write a paper for the anthology in Philosophy Portal, I don't do it for Philosophy Portal. It literally has to come from me. I can be like, oh, whatever, I don't care about this, so I will not do it. So this is really a strength of us that academics will never have. And there's this concept called genius. It sounds a bit ridiculous of a word, but I really believe it's true, and it's really grounded in love fundamentally, is that whenever there's exceptional, the idea behind this is that whenever there's exceptional figures in the history of art or philosophy, it's never just an individual, it's always grounded in a movement. And Freud said something very beautiful. He says, we are never so courageous as when we are sure of being loved. I'm paraphrasing here, but the point is that when we have someone who believes in us more so than ourselves, like we are so powerful, and we can get a lot of things done. So yeah, this is really a tremendous topic, and I think the work on psychosis and perversion, Big Sig, that you're researching about right now, psychosis and perversion and neurosis, is also super important, because especially the sadistic pervert, like it's super dangerous. It's super dangerous because these are kind of the people who indeed, like, they are the other for you, and they pretend to be your savior because this is what they get off on. And especially with like young people, it can be very dangerous for them, because the pervert gets off on the transference that another person has for them, right? And I mean, I've seen this happen in our intellectual communities as well. Pervert is very strange. It's very strange because he doesn't want to be hystericized. He will very, very, very reluctantly be hystericized. He will not really like to go to the clinic or really open up about that dimension. But ultimately, the pervert can be hysterical as well. So one of the things I'm interested in regards to the topic of the different like reaction formations we have to trauma is that, can you go from pervert to hysteric? Can you go from hysteric to neurotic? Where are we drawing the distinctions exactly? And I know that there's a lot of technical language about the pervert instantiating himself as the law of the father and equalizing it with desire on all of this. But yeah, this is yet again another open question. And yeah, like, I know about this idea that the perversion is the inverse of neurosis. First time I read that, it was very confusing to me. But of course, like, neurotics rely on perverted rituals. This is what they repress. These perverted rituals. So yeah.
Well, thank you, Dimitri. One, you're very kind. I appreciate the kind words. I'll pass it to Sam, Javier, and then Mr. Flores. And I do wonder, on the point, like, I think of Dante being kicked out and then writing arguably the greatest poetry of all time. Is there something where the AI will actually kick out all of humanity and basically thus create more people who are in that exile state to do that sort of thinking that isn't remembered at the time or appreciated, but actually ends up being a great source of genius, right? It's almost like AI kind of forces the choice, right? It's like, oh, you're going to have to either form a community of outcasts or just get quote unquote replaced. And it's interesting to think if, you'll actually see more people who will actually be driven to the outskirts, like Dante, and precisely in that state of exile, enter into some deeper and more valuable thought. Or, you know, it just ends up in the matrix and we're batteries in a tube or something, right? So anyway, but Miss Willem, it's good to see you.
Hello, good to see you too. I wanted to just take that little anecdote that you had told about like a child experiencing lack because AI creates the perfect video game and then he realizes that even that won't fill the void. I kind of wanted to take that image and then look in its mirrored reflection because I mean, I think I was a pretty weird kid and like I like to play video games. I don't know. The reason I want to do that is because things that I think pushed me more towards an early interest in psychoanalysis, probably around my teens, wasn't because of like experience with a lack. It was more due to, I think, experience of actually like a presence in a lack. I want, you know, sometimes I would look around at like kids, you know, I didn't grow up in a great neighborhood and I would see a lot of kids struggling to just like cope with like a lot of trauma, but like I felt really resilient, I think, as an adolescent. And I think I always felt that that was due to having lost my father when I was really young. I was 9 and you're just like on the brink of understanding death at that point. And I think actually just to like make it into a story, like my experience wasn't the lack of my father. My experience was like an overwhelming presence, like an omni father, you know, it was a supernatural father. I felt like his lack just made his love perfect, you know, like he was always with me. And in moments where I felt I was struggling, I would think to him, you know, like it, and I would feel supported by him, even though there's no presence of him at all, there was nonetheless. Yeah, so what is perceived as a lack and like I guess could be sort of grappled with as an absence or a deficiency, it really didn't feel like that at all. Similarly, video games, like, you know, maybe I don't know what a perfect video game is, but I found growing up that actually like, you know, video games are supposed to be terrible for kids and you know, you shouldn't give them too much screen time, but I had a lot of screen time. I was like staying up till the middle of the night and, you know, addiction is real. Those aren't really good tendencies. But the reason that I would think I was so addicted to video games back in those times was because like I was finding a whole world that I could explore and like it was igniting the imagination. Like these were real like aesthetic experiences that I was having. And I feel really grateful to have had them from like the distant point of a small Protestant town, you know, like where I couldn't go to art galleries, but I was able to have these arts. Yeah, and I think like this difference between like a lack as deficiency versus an absence as like an omnipresence. I kind of see that as like a qualitative sort of like a kind of qualitative rift that you can find between like the schism between Jung and Freud and those two like directions of psychoanalysis. In Jung, you know, like he sees the subconscious as peopled by like various and sort of autonomous, I guess, potencies or something. And whereas I think with Freud, like, I mean, I'm less versed in Freud, but I think like you have like complexes that are like exactly about like a lack. Anyways, another place where I thought that I thought might be a good anecdote to bring to this is like the experience of love, because I think, you know, when we do have profound love experiences, the experience is not that, oh my God, like it's not a love experience when you're like, oh, this person seemed perfect on paper, but they're not really doing it for me. Like that's a deficiency and that's not a love experience. But when you are in love, like you find yourself like totally blissful, but in addition to that, like completely terrified. Like it's it's a huge presence rather than a lack.
No, that's beautiful. And yeah, basically my childhood is Chrono Trigger and Final Fantasy VI. Both of those would be perfect video games. RPGs made the world a better place. Dimitri's phone's about to die. Stupid finite energy constraints. Let me pass it to Javier. And actually, Sam, I think there's actually a very serious discussion between like Ico, like that beautiful art game of genius, or Final Fantasy X is not the same as Halo. Like, I think we talk about freaking video games like a monolith where they're all the same. Some of those RPGs had the greatest stories, or Zelda Ocarina of Time. You really want to tell me this is an art? Like, these are an entirely different ball game of work as opposed to Flappy Bird or something, right? Like, games today are designed precisely for addiction. Games back then were like, that was immersion. That was something you carried around with you. And so I think we have to think about video games. That definitely was a big deal for my transformation. And in fact, playing like Chrono Trigger inspired the Sword of Tribulation, which inspired like back and forth Final Fantasy VI. The end of Final Fantasy X still rips me in two. And then between that and Studio Ghibli films, like anime and video games, like that's the stuff, guys. Like, that's education. So you go between those. And there's something extremely important about those things. And I think the question you're bringing up, and then I'll give it to Javier, on the question of lack, this is exactly right. If you experience lack where you say, oh, the perfect video game can be made, you have two choices. One, you can encounter that as saying, there is no such thing in the world as a perfect video game, because when the AI puts it forth, it's not that. You get to choose your response to that lack. One, how outstanding, because that means there's always something more to create because you never reach the perfect state. Or two, how terrible, because that will never exist. So the issue is like, lack is not nothing. The key with integrating with lack is actually seeing it as a space of opening possibility and creation and intrinsic motivation, as opposed to, well, what's the point? Actually, because it brings out to me one of the things Michelle and I were also talking about is the difference between the response of a child to AI versus an adult to AI. When an adult encounters AI, they say, oh my gosh, I'm going to lose my job. And I spent all these years learning how to do math, and AI can do it instantly, all the time I wasted. When a child, like our child, encounters AI, all they do is go, this is amazing. Wow. And it's very interesting because most of the conversation about AI, I think, is from people who are adults who are thinking about all the years that are going to be rendered, like makes them feel like it was meaningless because now computers can do that. And they're speaking from the economic position that they're in. But if you're speaking just to the AI as an AI, it's kind of a dream maker. You can dream something and it can just like manifest it. Which one might be why AI makes psychoanalysis more important, because it's like a dream state, right? Freud and all these different people, like you can think it's more, not obviously in the same way as a dream, but it's more of an encounter of what you want can manifest more readily because you don't need to spend 10 years getting the skill, which then means you have to encounter your wants, which can be traumatic. But then if you're a child, maybe the sooner you encounter that, the more you can develop in a good way, because definitely encountering the world, and I think bringing in video games is really good here. Because there is no doubt that playing those video games, I want to put in the realm of kind of life-saving. Like actually having a kind of life-saving dimension to me, precisely because it kept life alive. It brought a certain magic to it. Like my neighbor Tortoto can save lives, dang it. And so that right there, because then the lack of life becomes a mystery that's containing a certain presence pointing beyond itself. But you have to have those experiences, say you can find in stories or games or walks or whatever, to make the encounter with black more like a mystery than a certain like black hole sucking everything in. But that gets into what I like to call it the absolute choice. But the point you're bringing forth is exactly right. And yeah, the RPGs on the Super Nintendo were basically some of the greatest accomplishments of the human race. But let me give it to Mr. Javier Rivera and then Mr. Big Sig.
The encounter of lack, and then it seems to suggest a kind of formula for encountering lack, which almost seems counterintuitive to me. That to encounter lack, there's no formula to counter lack, and so on. So this notion of AI encountering lack, I've been struggling with the same problems with how do we know love, per se? How do we actually know love? And then we get into this problem with philosophy too, where we've made the error that we cannot come without presuppositions. We cannot make a presuppositionless idea and go from there. We have to start with a presupposition. And so the same thing with love. You have some type of idea of what it is, right? But what becomes problematic is that the person that you fall in love with also has another type of idea of what that love is. And then so this is the conflict and the tension and the frustration the entire time, right? Is that you think love should be conducted in some type of way, in some type of manner, and the other says the same thing, that love should be conducted in some type of way, in some type of manner. But real love is that sublation between the two ideologies of love, in my opinion. That when you say that, okay, obviously my idea, love does not conduct that way with this person, and the other realizes the same, that love itself does not conduct its way in that same fashion. And so real love is sort of between the two, right? But this is the weird part, right? Like the sublation is the fact that it is always between the two. But our ideas about love is always going to manifest. You're going to have another form and an idea of love. This is why it's a complete construction of love as two. And you always combat your own ideologies about love. The only thing that you end up knowing is that when you look at the past nostalgically together, you say, ah, yes, like, but that didn't work. You know, we had good moments, but these certain moments of friction, we cannot maintain this fantasies about love. And so in that sense, I say through the sublation that we know love. But the other thing that poses a bigger problem for me, is that what if you cannot be with someone? How does the one know love then? What does it mean for them? Like, for example, I think not Sam here, but the other Sam, she posted this long love story with Kafka, but it wasn't a love story in the sense it was about the doll. Like this little girl lost her doll, and Kafka basically bought a new doll for her without telling her. He's like, "Oh, I found it," and in the little doll, Kafka left a note for the girl and talked about how love kind of goes and then comes back and so on. And it was a very, in my opinion, a very genius notion about love. But I was like, you know, the preface of that whole story was that it started with Kafka never got married and never had kids. So how is it that Kafka has some notion, an idea about love? This is what bothers me the most, because the contemporary side of the world is that if you cannot be in an intimate relationship with the other, then you don't know love. Right? You don't know love. But is love reducible to that form of relation? That is the question that I am posing. Is it reducible to that relation? And the other thing is, are we assuming that Kafka does not have an other that is inside of him? Because actually Badu raised this question. He goes, we keep thinking about the external other, but there is also the other that is inside of us. So for me, that presents the idea that actually Kafka, people like Kafka, Nietzsche, and so on, they can know love, but only in the sense that they encounter the other in themselves. But the real question is, there seems to be no formula for that idea. How do you encounter the other in yourself, even though this is the self-help logic, right? Improve yourself, know yourself, so on. But I think that's the trap too, is that the self that is being promoted is self-identity, not the otherness that is the other in yourself. That is the problem that I have with the logic of the world today. Is like, yes, but I'm like, and this is why I also hate the notion of like, yes, make a boundary for yourself, because I'm saying, which self is making the boundary here? Is it the self-identity, or is it the one that is in conflict with itself that makes the boundary? And so hopefully we can make that in relation to knowing lack and having relations with lack. These are my questions.
I'll give it to Andrew. Well, obviously, writing horror stories is how you become a good lover. I mean, there's no doubt that Lovecraft probably had great relationships, and that friggin' manga writer who did the Spiral series or whatever, right? So you know that's the secret in different things. And now I'm thinking about the Not Two book that Mr. Flores talks about, and how we all kind of have a not two dimension where we're not two, but there's a two that you're also loving, and the not there's something interesting. But let me pass it to Mr. Flores. Mr. Flores.
Yeah, that's a lot of good points, and so I'm going to try to work through and tackle all of them, and hopefully quilt it in with AI. But I think Javier is onto something, especially like when you know, bringing up Kafka. Zizek mentions Kafka in Sublime Object Ideology. He mentions Kafka a lot in various texts, but Kafka as a critic of Althusser, because Althusser, like most of the structuralists, Levi-Strauss, wanted to dissolve the subject, that only saw a subject that was inscribed through just the discourse and only the discourse. He sees Kafka and the character in the castle as going through failed interpolation, because one of Althusser's notions of ideology is that the subject is always already interpolated. So the other that is in question, internalized by Kafka, is, you know, the sort of grappling with failed interpolation, because one of the things that ideology does is it tries to create a movement of totality. But as good dialecticians, we know that totality is always a series of failures. So it's always an inversion of a retroactive failure of working through the past. You could even tie in, I know you're a Kierkegaard bro, Javier, so like, you know, we live life forward, but we learn it, you know, backwards, right? He says something like that. I'm kind of paraphrasing it, but psychoanalysis is in the business of that. Zizek is in the business of that. Hegel is in the business of that, for lack of a better term, just to kind of, you know, be general. But what I'm getting at is that, like, this happens because of failure. You know, totality, there's no such thing as totality. There's no such thing as a totalized other. There is no meta language. And this is what allows us to traverse the fantasy, to sublate. And that's because of love as well, you know? And so the love that, you know, Kafka's dealing with, you could see is probably synonymous with the love that Freud, Lacan, and Zizek are dealing with. And that is not about an external other, because whether an external other is an institution, is a family, is a symbolic pact, they fail. But there's always the indivisible remainder that's still left of the barred subject for psychoanalysis that Lacan saw, that failed interpolation. This is the hysteria. This is the importance of the hysteric as the sublime subject that is working through the fantasy, that is trying to grapple with the dialogue it's having with the other, and this signification, the signifier, is dealing with a demand of love, right? And that's ultimately how language starts, through a demand that is inscribed by love and goes through this constant failed interpolation. And to kind of show how we could see this being worked through within ideology today, because when you look at like the Frankfurt School, they would see ideology as like something that's oppressive, dominating, making us neurotic. No. Ideology is making us more perverse. Tying this in with AI and showing how we are, you know, coping with lack. Well, Lacan has this, and Isabel Millar in this book on psychoanalysis of AI elaborates on this, the Lathus, or the Lat House. The Lat House is a concept in which jouissance can be recorded. He talks about, you know, oh, there's this recording machine, so most of you could record my voice and record this lecture and enjoy it later on. You can enjoy my voice outside of this lecture hall, and my voice continues to travel on through this recording machine. Well, what do we have now? We have algorithm, we have iPhones, we have Zoom, what we're doing right now. These are lathuses, which are pretty much extensions of ourselves to enjoy. And we could see this as in conjunction with the Santhome, right? The island of enjoyment. What we get now, to tie it in with how ideology functions, I hope I'm making sense of saying a lot, but we are dealing with perversion, as Zizek talks about. We're living in a perverse ideology. I said in earlier in the beginning of this conversation that what distinguishes a pervert versus the neurotic, because there's an inverse of each other, is that the neurotic, whether it's a hysteric or an obsessional, has to construct the object cause of desire through the fantasy, and yet keep that distance because they're afraid of the anxiety, even with the phobic as well. But the pervert is constituted by the fantasy in which they believe that they have this object and they inflict it on the other. They need a subject and they make themselves the instrument of enjoyment. How this ties in with ideology is to show that with the lactus, with technology, we can see a sort of libidinal investment into a kind of perversion. It's not necessarily a negative thing, just sexuality in general is already perverse according to Freud. It's the fact that we are constructed by an immediacy, an obscenity, which, you know, fantasy is already outside of us because it's shown in this video game. It's shown in, you know, these TV shows on how to enjoy. This is why Zizek says that cinema is the most perverted art form ever, because it's showing us our fantasy outside of ourselves, and we could be invested in it. With the lactus, with how information and technology has embedded our desire. And yet, if it's an ideology, and if these are new forms of communication and mediation for the message, for ideology, well, it's still going to fail. So when we are interpolated into a perverted structure, that shows us that we have everything, this superego injunction, which is that mediator that we grapple with because the big other lacks, but the superego is that inversion that kind of demands that we still enjoy, even if there is no big other, has to insist on that. And yet if we fail interpolation, now we're like, oh, how do we deal with, you know, living in a sort of ideology where we're traversing the failures of a perverse enjoyment that says there is enjoyment, there is an object, enjoy, get it right. Not, oh, you're not good enough. It's like, oh, you need to do more. We're not dealing with a neurotic ideology. We're dealing with a perverse ideology that says, do, be the best. Take what is more than you outside of yourselves and just be it. That's what therapy culture wants us to do. So we're dealing with that. And once we fail, we're left with this like anxiety that we have to come to terms with. And it's not really a negative thing. It's just the fact that this is what psychoanalysis and even the expansion of artificial intelligence shows, is that there is an extimate relationship between the two, between human desire, our lack, and artificial intelligence, and the problem of sexuality, the non-relation, and love.
That's a fascinating comment. And now I'd have to think about this. I'm wondering now if there's a way to look at Joseph K. in the trial as he's neurotic while everyone else is perverse. And the very fact that the protagonist can be neurotic while the world is perverse is a sense of freedom. And also why you can have the individual, so you can have freedom and neuroses. But then, of course, the problem is, I think the key with Joseph K. is precisely that his consciousness is structured in such a way by the environment where he is actively participating in his own movement toward execution, right? Where it's not like a direct sort of like Big Brother thing. Like if to me, you look at Orwell, Huxley, and Kafka, because they actually give you different things. And I think what's interesting is perverse oppression, if I understand correctly, gets into Huxley. That's more like of a Huxley sort of structure. And that's kind of the world we have today. That's what like Neil Postman was like. He took Huxley over Orwell in different things. But what's interesting to think is there a way, because when you look at all the characters like the penal colony, the castle, they like, and especially the trial, they kind of enjoy the system. They kind of enjoy like, no, we have the law. There is a law. You know, we actually have it. There isn't, of course, but they have it, and they're kind of holding it over Joseph K. Right? There's an enjoyment in that, and he's neurotic precisely because he doesn't even know where the law is or necessarily believe it, right? And then it's interesting there because I think that also to me gets into the problem of the kind of monotheory of saying that the self is always structured by discourse. I get what that's saying, But it kind of makes me think a few things. One, perhaps the mob and the mass, and belonging, again, we make a distinction between mob and mass. They're very similar, but they're not quite the same. Perhaps the mob and the mass is always structured by discourse, but Joseph K is not, precisely because he doesn't get the discourse. Or it could be like what Chetan was saying last week on if you're told that your hand, you don't have free will because the electrical signal from your head goes to your hand before the thought gets there or awareness, therefore you don't have free will. And Zizek makes this point, and Chetan brought it up. You still have the ability to say, no, I don't believe it. Like, I don't believe it. Like, you can say no, or like Bolteby in the famous story where he says, I prefer not to every time he's given a command. He's kind of forced to do an economic job. But the resistance is precisely the ability to not let your boss think you enjoy the job. And that like ruins everything. This guy, he always does what the boss tells him to do in the story, but he always, before he does it, says to you, I'd rather not. And that's like torture. It's like, I don't want to know that my workers don't want to be doing what I tell them to do. And how there's actually a kind of free will or freedom in that, even though you're situated in the system. And it's interesting to think of an analysis of Kafka as a neurotic situated within perversion, and how that right there actually functions to show that the discourse is not ubiquitous. Precisely because if you are structured by the discourse, you still have the ability to misunderstand the discourse or to say no to the discourse, right?
Right.
And that's what I think you see happening in Kafka, where, say, in Orwell and Huxley, the discourse seems much more ubiquitous, right? Like, or someone, whereas in Kafka, even if the character, precisely because the character is caught in the discourse, they are the protagonist in their no to the discourse or their misunderstanding to the discourse, which then brings out an interesting distinction between the pervert and the neurotic. And I actually do think studying Kafka today is far more important to understand how power works than Orwell and Huxley, even though I don't want to say they have, obviously Orwell and Huxley have a lot to teach us. And then with the other one who I adore, who's part of this, and I'll give it to Javier, is Thomas Pynchon with The Crying of Block 49, Gravity's Rainbow. Those are my favorite. I know he does Bleeding Edge, Mason-Dixon, so on. But The Crying of Block 48, that warns you basically about how pleasure, like, and then, of course, if we bring up anime, Soshi Kon, he made his whole career with Millennial Actress, Perfect Blue, Tokyo Godfathers, Paranoia Agent, precisely of showing you structures of perversion and how we don't, when you have characters captured in a perverse world who are just neurotic, but then come to actually identify with wanting to be perverse to kind of escape those psychological tensions. You see that in various episodes of Paranoia Agent. But now I'm just geeking out on anime because I'm always looking for an excuse to do that.
Okay. Something that was brought up about the postponement of enjoyment to enjoy later. Actually, I do think this actually corresponds pretty well with the culture that we have today. It seems like the dominating logic is that sacrifice now, self-annihilate now, so you can enjoy all the benefits later, basically. This idea is so perverse because it continues to feed the notion that self-sacrifice, self-annihilation for the enjoyment of later guarantees no failure. That even if you fail, you're not doing it right. Basically, that's how it continues in the cultural kind of language today. That if you are not sacrificing today, you can't enjoy it tomorrow. But if you can't enjoy it tomorrow, it's because you didn't sacrifice the right way. You didn't do it the right way. And so it continues the conversation, which to me, I'm very adamant about this idea of there was a failure somewhere with this idea of exchange, the system of exchange philosophy that I find very important. One is that it seems in relationships, it's impossible to not divide the labor in some type of fashion, right? Like we have to divide the labor in some ways. If you have kids, you have to be like, look, I'll do the dishes if you pick up the kids, so on and so on. Like the division of labor is inevitable. But how did the how did the philosophy exchange enter in this conversation? And when did it perpetuate the notion that if there is mutual reciprocation, then it is successful? Why did it immediately assume symmetry when, for me, it's inevitable that it's always asymmetrical? And when did sacrifice begin this notion of that actually, if I sacrifice myself, I can regain symmetry somehow? Like, to me, this is like the most perverse idea, because then sacrifice is no longer sacrifice. It is this idea that you are going to hold the other in a sort of infinite debt, really, by the continuing of self-sacrifice. And so the debt can never be repaid as such. And it does seem like the notion of the philosophy exchange actually is predicated on this idea of infinite debt. That self-help culture, everything that it promotes, whatever, is predicated on an infinite debt, which may be even the most capitalist ideology I've ever heard of. The idea of infinite debt, that they promise you that you can repay it if you sacrifice yourself. But the idea is actually you can never repay it. You can never repay it. The self-sacrifice never justifies what you are pursuing. And so for me, this is always problematic, because you find this in relationships most constantly, right? That I am sacrificing, I'm doing everything for the other, they're not doing anything, so on and so on. So how do we, how do we deal with that kind of notion? Because it definitely relates to our other notions of fantasy. That I am sacrificing for something and yet I am gaining nothing. And it seems like the biggest symptom of thought is to do this ironic move of, yes, the whole point is sacrificing is you're not supposed to get anything out of it. Sacrificing is because you love the person. Like that's it. It's very simple. It is a negation of negation. It is because you sacrifice that you complete the full negation of negation. It is because the other cannot do it that you sacrifice yourself and you do a full negation of negation, that love fulfills the law, per se. Because we understand that when we tell the other to do certain things, it is not guaranteed that they will be successfully done and reciprocated. And so, again, I don't think there is any formula to dealing with this problem. But I think the framework of sacrifice is very problematic, because everybody thinks that, yes, you have to give something so you can get something in return. But that is predicated on success, not failure. How do we deal with the systems of exchange, that includes failure? And I think this is actually the problem of why we can't encounter lack any sooner than what it is. Because as a child, it is basically promised in some ways, right? It is essentially promised that as a child, I will get my needs satisfied. There will be an exchange. I say, Mom, I'm hungry. My mother feeds me. Like, it is this idea. But the moment my mother doesn't feed me, right? It turns into a tantrum. I can't believe she's unfair to me, so cruel, and so on. And so it definitely feeds this logic of why can we not think of a sacrifice that is asymmetrical? Yeah, I'll leave it there.
That's lovely. I'll give it to Chetan, and Mr. Flores and Sam had to go. It was wonderful to have them. Mr. Luber came back. Mr. Luber, good to see you in your car, sir. And we actually do know what addresses it. We've talked about it. It's anime and video games, so I don't know why that's a mystery. And I'm also now wondering, now that's a good point you're saying, where there's no way to kind of bring forward lack, because there precisely almost has to be the development for the encounter and the experience of lack to hit you in a certain way. But maybe you could do it earlier, or maybe it could be more widespread, and then people would be able to sooner integrate with lack. I'm not sure. It's a live question. I don't have an answer. It's just, I'm thinking of all these unintentional or kind of wild things you don't expect that may come about with AI, as opposed to it's going to make robots and kill us all, which seems to be every other AI conversation, which, again, I understand the concerns. I'm not saying that the alignment problem or the Rice theorem or all that isn't a real problem, but I'm interested in, like, how children experience it who are not speaking from the trauma of the system, as opposed to adults. There seems to be an interesting difference. And I'm wondering if there's a difference. Yeah, it's almost like you're not sacrificing unless you also sacrifice the sacrificing, right? Like the sacrificing itself kind of has to vanish in the act. And I wonder if there's a difference between sacrifice that leads to debt and sacrifice as a kind of revelation. Like when Jesus dies on the cross from Azizek, it tears the veil, right? It like opens up and shows reality. Whereas there's the sacrifice of, I did this for you, therefore you owe. It almost seems like a difference between a sacrifice as exchange and then sacrifice as a kind of clearing, if we want to use Heideggerian language for Mr. Luber, which I like as well, like sacrifice where you create a clearing so something can come forth, like so that their being can come forth, or that sacrifice as revelation. Like, because that also would be like creative sacrifice, because you work really hard to create something to bring forth a product. Like there's people sacrifice for their work. That seems to be different from sacrifice in a relationship. It could be the same, but there seems to be like, maybe there's a difference between sacrifice and passion, right? Like passion, suffering for something you suffer for. But I think there's a lot there that's very interesting. And Chetan, it's good to see you today, sir.
Yeah, it's good to be here. It's a wonderful discussion. Just listening, and I was also sort of listening to a few podcasts on artificial intelligence from the past couple of days. So it all sort of ties up for me. On the question of, I think, lack in artificial intelligence, at least my experience as a kid, I was a little weird kid. I used to play video games for like 3 days continuously without sleeping, one of those kinds of experiences. And a very young age, we had a video game parlor near our house. So we'll just go to a video game parlor and we'll steal money from our mothers. And, we had very 1 rupee coins. So wherever we find the coin under the sofa and stuff, we put it in our pockets. We go to the video game parlor, we put it, and we keep, and we became so good at it that even if we had like 5 rupees, we could play the whole day, in that sense. And one of the things I think I realized with it, that when you think from the perspective of a child actually experiences lack just fine. I don't think it's a case that child is not experiencing it. Child knows that that satisfaction is not complete in that sense. Child is actually very fine with it. Child is somebody who doesn't have a problem with that anxiety that this is not going to satisfy me. Because a child will go back to it in that sense. The problem happens once the child starts going away in the child in that sense. The problem starts at that point when you start seeking something else from it than that passionate energy that you have towards that, that activity in that sense. I think that's the first question. I think the problem of lack or working through lack in that sense is primarily a very adult problem. A child actually has something innate through which he's already working with that gap in one form or the other, which is how he can acquire language. A child can acquire language. He can acquire. So there is something about a child which needs to be thought through within this sense. This question of acquisition and learning distinction that we draw in sometimes cognitive sciences and linguistics, and especially that acquisition is something which happens subconsciously. It's something which happens automatically, and so on and so forth. And learning is something which you have to consciously do. A child can learn much faster because for him those processes are much more, his subjectivity actually lies at the point of the unconscious itself. His child is not somebody who's calculating, if that one way to put it is in that sense. Now, I'm not saying all children are like that. I'm just saying the child rests more on the side of non-calculation in that sense. So that's the first point. The second question regarding the artificial intelligence that we need to think about, I think, is that it's not a question that artificial intelligence will actually make us realize much faster that there is no complete satisfaction. I think the question with artificial intelligence is that it would fundamentally alter the ground of satisfaction itself. What I mean by this is that when we start thinking about artificial intelligence, we think about simply as something which will extend an existing technological. For instance, we think we like playing video games. So now the child would ask the artificial intelligence that, oh, give me a perfect video game. but probably the desire to play video game is our problem. That problem would not exist for a child who's been grown up with artificial intelligence. The minute the child can say, give me a video game, and an artificial intelligence can make the video game for the child, the video game itself as a concept would fundamentally alter. It would not be video games that the child would be asking. So, for instance, a child growing up in artificial intelligence times would be thinking about questions of, for a child, the distinction between artificial intelligence and human being might get blurred. Child might not know he's talking to a bot or another human being. And he might not care after a point because he's not grown up in that context. Questions of intimacy. At what point an artificial intelligence can give you intimacy as a human being? And if an artificial intelligence can give you intimacy, at least in a short period of time, how would a child find the importance of another human being's language? Would that, and this monopolization of language or by the artificial intelligence, what is at stake in this? It is that artificial intelligence is learning to use language. And once artificial intelligence monopolizes language, what you have is not that there is no other language or human language left. That's not the problem. The problem is there's no way to distinguish language from something other than language in that sense. That for a child, intimacy would be with a bot itself. What is at stake in that question? It's an open-ended. I don't want to make a doomsday over here. But I'm interested in asking what is at stake in these fundamental changes, where till now we've always experienced language in relation to another subject, which is how we can discuss perversion, neurosis in these contexts in this manner. And we can have a longer discussion upon this question of diagnostic categories. But at what point, when you associate language with something which you cannot associate subjectivity in the same manner? What is at stake in it? How do we evaluate that now? Would a child have the sensitivity of thinking that my bot will feel pain? Or would a child know he doesn't feel pain and yet I can feel intimate with him? It's a yeah.
That is fascinating, Chetan. That was all wonderful. And that is the most beautiful blue I have ever seen on a wall in my life. That blue paint, I am envious. That is fantastic. So now, we talked to Parallax yesterday and we came up on this question. This is a really good point that's really good on this notion that really a child doesn't experience, they experience lack, but they experience it you just play the video game again. You need to do something with it, right? And that is where, for me, we had that paper where we said lack is also the very condition of intrinsic motivation, or to keep motivating, right? If you get rid of lack, you also get rid of the self-turning wheel possibility, right? So now I'm wondering if the reason we experience lack is so devastating is precisely because there's a difference between that lack as a child and the lack of working 40 years at a job you didn't want to do to get something that then you get it and it's not what you thought it was. It's almost like going through a system that you didn't want to go through to suffer to gain something, and then it's not what you thought it was going to be, is much more devastating of an encounter of lack. So I wonder if there's a difference between the child that experiences lack as, oh, I need to play the video game again, and so it's okay, versus the adult who does 20 years of something they don't want to do, and then they encounter the internet. It is like lack, and it's more devastating, because it's not so much the lack that devastates, but the idea that you sacrificed as an exchange that then doesn't pay up at the end. So I wonder if sacrifice in the way Javier was talking about and lack as an adult is the difference, more so than even the lack. Now, I'm not sure about that, but there's something interesting there where, yeah, because the problem is it's adults talking psychoanalysis, right? It's always adults talking psychoanalysis. So they're going to talk about the lack as primary. But what if it's actually the sacrificing for the lack that doesn't pay back? that coupling that's the main problem, not the direct encounter with lack where you just go play video games again, or you just create. It's like the kids, their fort falls apart. So what do? Build another one. They don't get like in the fort, they can always build a bigger one. They don't think of it as devastating. So that's interesting because definitely, and then I'll give it to you, Mr. Luber, one of the things Michelle and I were pushing back against. So like I said, I really wish we would have, like this came up at Parallax yesterday on kids encountering lack sooner. And this is a really interesting angle on it, Cheetah, and I really appreciate your comment. Because I really think we're talking about AI as adults. And we got to think of it as a child, and that's going to, like you say, bring an entirely different paradigm with it, right? Like Zach Stein, who I respect highly and think he's a genius, is talking about the threat of people like having a love relation. Like, if you could speak to Socrates every day with AI, would you have an unhealthy relationship with the AI, right? Well, there might be a difference between the child who carries the trauma caused by the system speaking with the Socrates AI versus the child who never has that trauma because AI undermined the system and then they're talking to Socrates as AI, right? So there may be traumas the system causes that the AI will undermine, that then means those traumas are not there. So the character of the relation with AI changes, right? Like we've got to think of the whole, like I think a lot of the AI conversation is just adding AI to the current system, as opposed to thinking about the relation with AI with an entirely new paradigm brought on by that very new AI. And I really like that question of, will you think you can have intimacy with AI if it can't feel pain? Does that mean love and solidarity are necessary? Do you need solidarity to have love? Can you have love without empathy? People love their dogs. They don't think their dogs have the same existential struggles as they do, right? But is that really love or just like? Now I'm thinking we got to talk about Ghost in the Shell because all the Japanese animes were talking about this stuff a long time. Let me get to Mr. Luber and Javier. And yeah, Ghost in the Shell was on it, man. Ghost in the Shell knew. Mr. Luber.
What I'm really fascinated about is the whole notion regarding how these typical things like video games, movies, these different forms of entertainment in this futuristic AI world, since they would be so readily available and made to perfection for every subject, that they're just not going to call it a movie or a video game. They're just it's just going to be more part of their being there, so to speak. So they're going to have different terms for it. So that just makes me think that a movie it just makes me think right now, when we look at a movie, it's like an alien. It's not part of being there. And that what AI is going to be doing is bringing all these alien-like things into our being there-ness. And that makes me think, what's going to be alien at that point? If we have basically this mechanism that takes in anything that's potentially alien and brings it into our being there-ness to such a degree that we're not going to be yeah, exactly right, something crazy like that honestly makes sense to me, because it could be something so today nonsensical, but because it's so nonsensical, like those nonsensical things will be the alien type of things. Like, what is our dog thinking? You know, what are these things that are so foreign to us that we can't even imagine tapping into? So I just kind of wanted to pose, I guess Daniel answered my question, you know, squirrel thoughts. I was posing to Cheetan, what would be alien to us? What could be alien to us in that future? I was just curious with that. And then with Javier, you were just saying really good things earlier. It's just making me think about how, like in LA, like a lot of people out here think they're perfect and that they don't have a lack. And what's funny is, I was actually just talking about this with my coworker today, where he continually asks, like, why am I doing this? What is the purpose? What is the meaning of my life? And he thinks it's just very bad that he keeps asking these questions. And I was explaining to him how it's not bad at all. It's actually really good, and that it's healthy, and that if you weren't asking these questions like, am I happy? Am I free? then you wouldn't actually be happy or free. And it just seems like, for me, like what Sam was saying, how lack wasn't something that I'm missing, but it's present in my being there. Not to keep saying being there, but that's just how I think about it. It's just interesting to think that if you're not asking these questions, if you assume I'm free, it's like at that moment when you say I'm free, you're not free. Like it's in the act of questioning if you're free and doubting if you are free that you are free. So it's just making me think people within the paradigm of not questioning, of not challenging their paradigm or their worldview, if they can be happy, if they actually can obtain these states that people that are in a constant state of questioning are always striving to get to, but because they're in this constant questioning, it seems like they never actually get there. But the thing for me, and then I'll pass it on to Javier, is because you're constantly striving to be in a certain place, and you're asking yourself questions that are challenging you for the sake of getting to this place, that in between space of always striving for, is that where happiness is? Is that the only dimension of where happiness is? Is there a place that is stagnant, that is happy? Does it always have to be this constant back and forth, this constant contemplation? For me, I don't see how there could be a place, but it's nice to think about if there is a place where people can be happy, because it really does seem like, at least in LA, how everyone thinks they're perfect, that their life is amazing and it can't be better. If they actually, have obtained this like nirvana that I'm just like, it's just over my head, or I'm just tricking myself and thinking, yeah, what I'm doing, me questioning and me giving myself headaches all the time, that's right. But maybe it's not right. Maybe they got something that I don't, and I'm not seeing it. So I just kind of wanted to see what you guys thought about all that.
Well, I'll give it to Javier. The answer is definitely squirrels will be the new aliens. I have no doubt about that. Second, what you are asking is actually like the entire like sociological question of like belonging again, the difference between givens, releases, and so on. You see, the issue is that if you have the kind of there is a genuine happiness that comes from being free of what David Hume and through Livingston refers to as philosophical melancholia, which is what occurs. Like once you are introduced to philosophy, there's a melancholia that can come with that. The issue is that if you don't suffer that, you are finding belonging through pure givens, which means you are susceptible to the banality of evil that Hannah Arendt talked about in totalitarianism. Because if those people in California are so perfect, then guess what? Those Trumpers are a big threat. And those others who have different views that threaten their perfect peace become a danger. So the issue is that in pluralism, everyone, like, if philosophy is the only way, you have to go through the Inferno, the Purgatorio to get to the Paradiso following Dante and Hume. You have to go through philosophy to the Ivory Tower and then come back to common life. There's temptations and obstacles all along the way. Or else, the only way you can have that quote-unquote stability is by keeping out the other, who would make you ask those questions or figuring out ways to keep things shallow. That's what like Hunter, Philip Reeve, Berger, and all of them are talking about. And basically today, like, yeah, all the conservative people have basically done the same things. Like we had our small town life. It was all great until the big government came and they've thrown everything off. It's only a matter of time before the other or the economy collapses and ruins California or something. And then you don't have the given. And then if you haven't done the philosophical work, you're not ready to handle that opening up of the loss of the givens that make your life perfect. And that's when you tend to respond with a lot of existential anxiety, and you tend to become a mass, which would be totalitarian, or a mob to regain that givenness. So basically, philosophical melancholia is the cost for being able, you have to go through that to start working toward the place of a meaning and belonging that is not contingent on sociological conditions of which become susceptible to manipulation, mass, mob, banality of evil, all those things. And basically the entire world has not been ready for that. And basically, if we look at someone like freaking Dugin, the fourth political theory is basically a return out of philosophical melancholia by separation, so you don't encounter the other, but somehow still maintain multilateral trade agreements and interaction, so you're not isolationist. Now, that's where I think Dugin's theory gets very fuzzy, but one can definitely see that's a strategy. But the issue that we basically, for me, with the address of belonging again, is precisely not giving into that temptation of finding that satisfaction in a state of isolationism. But that means you do have to go through the philosophy, because you have to encounter the other. And the moment you encounter the other, that demands questions of you. They're Hindu, I'm Christian. Why am I Christian? How do I relate to someone who thinks different from me, right? Oh, they believe in Trump, I don't. You know, bam, then the why. The encounter of the other brings the question mark. And that's where basically all of the brilliant sociologists were screaming at the top of their lungs. They're like, we're not ready for a substantive democracy where true others encounter one another and learn how to interact. And if you don't, it's going to be the return of totalitarianism, like, you know, in Hunter's book Before the Shooting Begins. Like, we just haven't read the sociologists, like the smart ones. So we're not ready. And they were, and before the shooting again, he's like, look, what happened in the Balkans, these different like tribalizations and different things. And this is written in like 91 or something. He's like, that's going to happen everywhere, because people don't know how to engage in a substantive democracy that it inherently and necessarily brings in philosophy, because no one wants to bring in philosophy, because the moment you do, you're asking those questions. You're like, this is bad, I shouldn't ask them. Well, yeah, but if you don't ask them, then you're going to be one of those people contributing to the mob or the mass, or you're not going to be able to defend yourself when the totalitarian shows up, or you're not going to be able to keep yourself from being Joseph K. that pulls yourself deeper into the trial, because you're not able to organize your consciousness against the pull of the trial and all of the zeitgeist that's leading you in that direction, or the mouse in a little fable. So yeah, Dante tries to get out not going through Inferno, but then he encounters the she-wolf, then he encounters the lion and all these different things. The only way is to go through the Inferno, which in this context is the philosophical melancholia. If you do not go through that melancholia, there is a price. There is a cost. But the issue is, the cost doesn't show up until one day when it does, and then when it does, it's too late. And the same way that if you don't have a fire extinguisher, it's fine, it's fine, it's fine, and then one day your oven's on fire, and it's too late. That's the problem. The philosophy is a kind of fire extinguisher. 99% of the time you don't need it, but when you need it, if you don't have it, the consequences can change your life. It can change everything. So to me, it's not a very good life insurance policy. But let me pass it on to Mr. Javier Rivera and Chiton.
You know, the suicidal man, for me, is sometimes the most honest. When he says, there is no reason to live, I have no meaning, and so on and so on. The mistake that the suicidal man mistakes is that it becomes a perverse enjoyment for him. That now he has to take his life. But in my opinion, the most suicidal thing to do is to live. Like, this is my ironic stand. Like, that's the difference between the man that is, I mean, the suicidal man is honest. The only thing that he needs to do is do this ironic move where he goes, but you know, because there is no reason, that's why I live. That's why I choose to live. And so the people that are obsessed with their perfection, like Andrew is talking about, they don't understand that actually the very reasons that constructed their life is also the very reasons that will destroy their life. Because the moment it's not there, they are once again going to be made an honest person. They're going to be like, I have no reason to live. There's no meaning in my life. Why am I not doing this? There's no point in doing this. It's pointless, and so on and so on. And this is for me, this is the pivotal stage in life, because now you have to say to yourself, do I fall into another trap of constructing another reason, another way of living, and do it again? Or do I do the most ironic move that I realize that there really is no reason? And that is also the most beautiful idea, that there is no reason. And so I do it anyways. like Kierkegaard says, because I'm a Kierkegaard bro. The reason is because the work itself. The work itself is the reason. Like there is nothing else. Like Kierkegaard says, the beauty of the human being is the fact that you have to work and you have to choose. There is nothing else beyond that for Kierkegaard. In some ways, of course, I'm generalizing. The other thing is this question on AI is very interesting because actually, when it comes to the child, if we even look at the history of racism, you can see why this is important. Because if you think about it, there's a point in history with racism where integration did not happen. And then racism was very apparent. You see the separation and so on, right? But if you're a child that did not experience that lack, that separation, and you are already thrown into this idea of integration, what notion of racism do you have? You don't have any notion of racism until it's brought up that historically they were separated and that all these catastrophic events happened and so on and so on. So the child immediately, in my opinion, becomes sort of conflicted immediately because he wasn't initially looking at the kid that had a different color than him differently initially. It wasn't until the system says historically this is what happened that now the child has to grapple with the melancholia of history and the other. And same thing with the one that has been oppressed. He wasn't probably immediately thinking he was oppressed, but all of a sudden it becomes acknowledged through the system that he has been oppressed. And so we are leaving the kids to their own devices in this kind of factual history. Like we just sort of leave them to deal with it in some ways. And this is the problem that I have with just telling history, because I'm always curious about the idea of what if we didn't say it? What if we didn't say it? What would happen? Would we start looking at each other differently if we didn't tell that history? Because this is where I feel like what Daniel's talking about happens, right? The adult wants the child to know the lack. But this is the issue too. We are reducing lack to its specific form that the adult knows the lack. We already agreed that the child knows lack. But what is problematic between the adult and the child is that we want the child to know the specific form of lack that we experience as adults. And this is problematic because by virtue, the one thing that the adult is missing is the form of lack that the child has. We cannot imagine what it would be like to already be integrated without already knowing the history. And this is problematic in some ways. And this, I feel like, also is kind of what perpetuates the racism too. Because there is no forms of forgetting. But also, we don't know how to deal with, how do we deal with the factuality of this history and then forget? How do we deal with that ironic move where it's like, yes, it happened, but forget? Because now what ends up happening is that, again, we go through some system of exchange where the self-sacrifice before the integration was necessary so that integration could happen, all the revolutions and so on. And then now there must be some type of repayment, some type of form of, bring justice. And justice always demands some type of infinite debt in some ways. At least this is our logic right now. And for me, I find it very problematic just because we're thinking as adults. I don't think the child is thinking in that manner. I don't think a child watches anime and sees all the cultural oppression and so on. I don't think the child sees that. I don't know why academia perpetuates that notion to us and then expects us to say, yes, that's what it is, when in reality, if you just watch it, it really says none of those things. You have to experience some type of form of lack to say that's what it is. So I feel like that is the impasse of thought that we are experiencing, in my opinion. That we don't know how to solve this problem. We don't know how to deal with the facts of history and then deal with the opposite maneuver. how do we go through the melancholia without perpetuating the system of the same idea? Because we think that telling the history gets rid of the idea. It doesn't get rid of the idea. It perpetuates the idea. You start looking at each other differently, you know? I mean, I remember as a child, for the first time, my mom told me, "Oh, they're probably being racist to you." And I said, "What? I thought they were just being mean." Like, that was my honest child perception, that the kid was just being mean. I had no conception that it was about my color or my position in the world, you know? So yeah, I'm gonna leave it there.
No, I'll pass it to Chicha. I think that's very interesting to incorporate the question of race with AI. It gets very interesting because, so for example, one of the reasons in America they had to do the Jim Crow South is precisely because all of the people wanted to hire the black workers, not the white workers, because they were better laborers than the white. And then all the poor whites who couldn't get jobs then put together a voting block to then create the Jim Crow South, precisely because everyone wanted black workers and you had black wealth that was coming on. But then there's an issue that it does seem in some children, like you have the doll experiment and different things, there's a recognition of difference, which then it's like there is a recognition of difference, it can seem, but then like the meaning of that difference can be socially conditioned, because once it's illegal to use the same bathroom as blacks, then you start rationalizing it. And that's why we have the equality and its immoral limits and the belonging again, for a quick plug there. Law teaches, as Robert George will say. Like, if it's illegal for whites and blacks to use the same space, it must be good that they don't use the space. Well, wait a minute. Why would it be good that they don't use the same space? Well, I know whites are good because I'm good. It must be because blacks are bad. And you see the law teaches. You start rationalizing around it. But the very susceptibility of people to think that way may be tied to innate capacities to create hierarchy in Alue Demon Homo Hugactus, or this very way to organize, like boy, girl, black, white. There seems to be an interesting question about some innate tendency to find distinction, but then the meaning of that distinction is what sometimes adults can assume, right? Like they can assume, oh, you see that distinction because you think you're superior to the other. Maybe, maybe not. It might depend on the context, right? And so that's the issue when it comes to AI. No doubt, children will immediately see a distinction between AI and the adult and themselves, right? The question is the following: where they say it's better than me or I'm better than it, or will they see a distinction that simply means, oh, AI can do math. I thought I was good at math. I must not be that good at math. I better get good at doing something AI can't do, right? Like you're saying, oh, it wasn't racist, it was just being mean. The meaning of the difference that the child sees is something that the adult can project that may not be so given. Now, it gets tricky, because if the parents are racist, for example, and the child is then taught to be racist, should the institutions and the schools try to intervene to stop that, right? This is where it gets all kind of difficult. But again, it gets very, I do think, like if you're talking race and taking America as a case study, the period between like the civil, like just before the Jim Crow South, but you had an ending of various, like that's a fascinating period, because the demand for black labor and black was just through the roof, because all these white people for all these years had depended on black labor, so they had no skills, so nobody wanted to hire them. And so precisely because nobody wanted to hire them, they're like, well, we're going to use political power then to stop that from happening. So then you see how political power can be used, can be used to preserve racism, which now today we want to use political power to stop racism. And that means you are dealing with something dangerous, and it becomes very tricky. And I do think that's going to arise where like maybe people are going to want the government to make AI illegal in school, precisely so that kids don't get confused on their place and think that it is human when it's not. Maybe people are like, oh, AI job, maybe it should be illegal to use AI in companies. Like we're going to have a lot of temptations that are actually going to, I do wonder, it's funny that Javier brought that up, because I have been wondering if that period of the formation of the Jim Crow South would actually be useful to see some of the temptations that people have with AI. Because what people did with black labor may be what they start to use political power to do against AI in different ways and similar ways. I think that would be quite curious, when now we all kind of understand that that sort of separation can be very problematic. Well, likewise with AI, it could be problematic, but then also like that opens all the doors of, well, basically this, it gets to Andrew's point, and then I'll pass it to Chichon. If you do not separate races, then there's an encounter of difference, which means people will be what? More philosophical. What does it mean that we're different? What does it mean that they have different cultures? So now philosophy starts to thread. Well, with that can come melancholia. Well, when you feel melancholia, that's why the temptation of separation, isolationism, getting away from those liberals, getting away from those conservatives become temptation. Likewise, when you encounter the AI so closely, that's going to bring with it automatically philosophy, because what worth do I have? What does it mean to even be human? The average person will start asking philosophy. So another way to look at racism is what you do to avoid philosophy. Racism is something you can do to avoid philosophy. Like segregation, separation is a way to avoid philosophy. A lot of liberal people don't always appreciate that if you're going to bring otherness together, that opens the door to philosophy and melancholia, unless you do what Hunter critiques of the multiculturalism, where you say, oh yeah, we're different, but in the end, we're all the same, because we're all the same human race. And that's what Hunter and all the sociologists are like, no. You cannot do that. You cannot say that difference is merely culture or clothing or holidays or food. No, culture is freaking deep. And the multicultural strategy, which a lot of people mean a lot of things by that, the problem with that is it treats people as not actually different. In the end, we're all just human, and the difference is just kind of tertiary and accidental. But the truth is, it's deep. Well, if it's deep, that means difference brings philosophy. And with that, that means it brings the melancholia. And with it, that means you have to develop the skills. So if we're going to do this thing called pluralism, then the guy saying I shouldn't be asking these questions because they're bad, no, you must ask those questions, or be an anti-pluralist, basically, or be against difference. But that goes completely against what people think. Like, especially more, generally in California, you'll have more liberal people, which is an emphasis on inclusion. That very emphasis on inclusion comes with the cost of philosophy. If you're going to do it, if you're going to do it. Now, if you say, well, I don't want to do philosophy, well, then at the same time, you have to be against inclusion. And you have to go, no, I don't want that. Well, guess what then? We have to go through Inferno. Let's see what Virgil's doing. Maybe he'll guide us through. Be pretty difficult. But if we can come through it, then we might be able to get to Beatrice and go to the Paradiso. If you can go through this challenge, I do think the subject can attain something unique in human history, but the challenge is real. It requires going through that philosophical melancholia. But let me pass it to...
I wonder at what point animals would start asking for justice. And where would humans hide the day that happens? You'll know your racism then in that sense. But yeah, it's me being insensitive towards the racism question. But yeah, that's all right. I think the question of presupposition is extremely important that Daniel is raising. If we become ambivalent towards our own presuppositions, fundamentally we lose philosophy. Definitely, there is no impulse to do philosophy then, because then you do not, your background becomes fixed for you even when it's not in some senses, and the minute the background starts becoming more important, the question of philosophy starts coming back into picture. You can't escape philosophical thinking at that point. Then the minute your back, there's a stability of the background that you were imagining doesn't exist for you anymore. Suddenly philosophy becomes and I think it is here that we can enter into the question of Luber's question of alienness into this picture. I remember Yuval Noah Harari in that few days back in some podcast was saying that artificial intelligence is already an alien intelligence invading us. In some senses, that's how he was trying to think about it. That alienness is already here in that sense. I don't agree with him, to be honest. I don't think the question of artificial intelligence is a question of alien intelligence. Fundamentally, in that sense, of course, it does shift the ground on which we think about intelligence in that sense. But what artificial intelligence is projecting is not something alien it's our own fantasy back to us. Because artificial intelligence, for all its greatness, eventually is a form of intelligence which can calculate, which is using our own history back at us. So if artificial intelligence was invented when we did not have this history behind us, it would be a very different thing. What is at stake is not simply artificial intelligence. What is at stake is our own history in relation to artificial intelligence. because artificial intelligence can give back to us what we have already lived. So what is the alien over there is already a projected fantasy of our own, and that's something we need to think about. The alien is not truly alien, which is why if and this is something we know from movies itself. When you look at the Will Smith movie Independence Day, and you look at the alien is actually the projection of the human. The alien wants to conquer. Alien wants to. Who said to alien life would want those same things that we and you, think about? But that is how they could imagine an alien in that sense, because that imagination of alien was a fantasy of what would something outside look like to us, in that sense. And artificial intelligence, and which is why Signorelli's point about perversion is important. But this is a pervert game. It's a pervert game to the extent that your own fantasies projected back. It's you're not encountering something authentically alien. That's I think the one point. I think one of the very, very interesting works in this regard is Hannah Arendt's work of Human Condition, and it's a very, very wonderfully written book. I'm reading it these days as part of a reading group. Why it's very wonderful is because the question of condition is used very beautifully in that sense. That what conditions the human in that sense. So she uses things like human beings are born and they die. And what effect does that have upon human life? And she uses many other things, that we are born on Earth. We can't go to other planets and so on and so forth. What conditions the human being? That question of conditioning is a question of the background. And once that background starts to shift, once that background itself needs to be taken into account for, what is at stake in that? There's a lot. I think there's a lot to be said in that regard. That at what point does that background become important for human being? I don't think it's a simple question of difference over there. To be honest, Daniel, I think there's something more there, because simply difference coming into the picture also makes the human being completely say that background, nothing can be done about it. Let's do violence and segregate again. Simply this invasion of difference actually makes the human being more insecure, isn't it? The real is always traumatic in that sense. It's always horror. It's always traumatic if you access it directly. At what point we develop a language to access the real? What point we develop that grammar is a difficult question to think about. I'll just sort of stop here in that sense. Hannah Arendt is sort of trying to think about the public nature of that problem. It's a very interesting book. But it's a question we need to think about, that at what point does human being becomes capable of doing philosophy? At what point human beings starts becoming capable of thinking about their own background? What kind of stability we need in our conditions for that to happen?
What Chetan is asking, Badu would say mathematics. Because Badu says something interesting about this, but like mathematics is like almost pointless. Like that's the way Badu almost says. Like it has no meaning, and so on. And it's like this weird position, almost similar to philosophy in a way. But I wanted to get back to the question of the AI and everything else. This is what I've always been saying. It's like the AI question is always not, until this is what's interesting about even what's that anime? You talked about it. What is it, Daniel? Can you say it?
Ghost in the Shell.
Yes, Ghost in the Shell. Yeah, Ghost in the Shell. Yes. Because the previous question that Chetan was raising is, can we have affection for an AI and so on? This actually raises a very interesting idea about the human condition. Because as far as I know about the human condition, and if you study anthropology and everything, is that, when I was taking my Japanese class, there was strong human affection when the Tamagotchis came out, and the children had strong affection for the Tamagotchis, to the point that if the Tamagotchi died, they could not restart the Tamagotchi. They had to ask their parents for a new one. So for me, that already shows that in the case of the child, it is possible that they may not actually discern the difference that we are discerning in the way that we are applying meaning in that way. And so that was a very interesting case study, that the children that were emotionally attached to the Tamagotchi or the little robot dogs, the fact that they held funerals for them and that they had such a affection of not restarting the Tamagotchi, like once the Tamagotchi died, that was it. They had to get a new one. Whereas the parents were sort of bewildered by this act. They were like, why can't you just restart it? Like, it's just, it's just like a little toy, and yet the child understands the affection in this way. So there is something about the human condition, in my opinion, that, and this is why love becomes a very important topic, because the problem that we have is that we keep reducing love to some type of form. We keep thinking that love is reducible to some type of form, that love can only exist within this form and another form and so on. And yet constantly we are proven wrong, that animals have rights and children are having this affection towards Tamagotchi, and so on. And even the idea that actually the more that, I think I was reading a couple of articles on how even in playing in games, there's this concept that this one guy called it tinkering. He said that the more that you're in the world, the more affection that you're already building. The fact that you're working in the virtual world builds some type of connection, some type of emotional affection that penetrates into our being. So there is something about this idea of human beings, the more that we persist and just being there, we create some type of affection that not all of us can, let me put it this way. We, for some reason, as human beings have this, I think, it's not in the realm of knowledge, I would say. I think that's the mistake. The capacity of the condition for the human being is not in the realm of knowledge, but in the realm of love, I think. And that is, that's what I would assert. And I think that is the overhaul of AI, is that we have spent too much time obsessing over human being as the one that knows, right? Rather than the human being, the one that loves despite of. And I think that's why the AI question is so terrifying, because we have predicated our love for knowledge in such a perverse fashion that we don't know now what to do with ourselves, because what is my utility? This is a question of knowledge. What is my utility? What is my purpose? And so this is when knowledge, I think AI exposes the gap in this arena. The gap that really, it's not a question of AI, but is a question of what is man. Again, we are confronted with the question of what is man. Because if we're already asking the question, can man love something else? Can he have a relationship with this alien thing? I mean, we've had relationships with divinities, statues, rocks. I mean, this is the most amazing part about the human condition. And yet, this is what is amazing, that even when I feel that I do something wrong, I can say, oh, I've caused God pain. I've betrayed God, right? Like, it's the idea that this affection exists. This is what's really stunning to me, is that the human beings can do this. That I can, yeah.
I mean, imagine an AI writing a religious book, and now you have a cult which says that AI is the God, and we follow this religious book. Anyway, for us, God came from a non-human intelligence. The Quran came and the Bible came from God in that sense. So how do you think through that? So what would the psychology of the AI be like?
Yeah, I mean, that's what I'm saying. Like, I feel like that's what's like hard for me about the human condition, is that because we can do this, it's the idea that we can do this, that we can take the AI, we say that religion is different, but when Chetan lays it out perfectly, like the way he did, we've been complaining about the same thing for ages, right? The fact that there is this idea, this unknown alien divinity came down, wrote a book, and then we all follow it and believe it. And then yet here we are, we're about to do the same thing with the AI. And so it becomes a question again with that we cannot, it becomes a religious question, I think, again. It becomes a religious question again. I'll leave it there.
Either become religious or philosophical. You can choose your side.
Yeah.
No, there's a lot of wonderful things there. It is kind of funny because we're always like, love is unconditional, and that's why love is great. But then if you love AI, we're like, no, there's a condition. So it's very interesting that when you actually see the logical end of what you're saying, you start to go, that's not what we meant. You're not supposed to love people outside your race, not outside your species, so on and so forth. And it's interesting because like David Joyce in his work emphasizes how there is no necessary limit to knowledge, right? Like there's no reason there's ever a limit to how much we can know, right? And if you hear that, you go, oh, that's magnificent. Oh yeah, great. And it's kind of, it's a case he's making for opticism. But if I say to you, likewise, there's no limit to what humans can love, most people would go, oh yeah, that's wonderful, exactly, including AI. No. And so it's interesting how when you start really taking seriously that love is unconditional, it is more existential than saying knowledge is unconditional. And that goes to show you how love is tied to identity somehow, more so identity. Because if I were, there's a way in which if I know how the universe works, I don't lose myself in the universe. But if I love AI, if I know how AI works, that's great. But if I love AI, I somehow lose myself. And in a way that's very bad. But isn't love losing yourself? Isn't maybe the only possible love is the love of danger, of the love that might be bad. Like the love where you could lose yourself, and that losing yourself may not be good, right? Because like loving AI, if you lost yourself in AI, that might be bad. Well, maybe that's the ground of real love or something. I'm not sure, but like it is interesting how is the only truly unconditional love the love which pushes conditions, right? And if that's the case, maybe it is only by loving AI that humans can love unconditionally, right? Because otherwise they're loving within the condition of humanity, right? So it's interesting to think that when we say unconditioned, we actually always assume a certain background or prejudice in that assumption of condition. Like obviously, I mean unconditional relative to another human. Oh, is that so obvious? Well, now if you say that humans should only love unconditionally relative to other humans, you have to philosophically justify that. And now you're in philosophy, right? In different things. So it's interesting to think how the question of loving AI as opposed to knowing according to AI is precisely what brings to the forefront the human condition. Because the other thing, what Chetan brought up is this interesting idea that the human condition is always a conditioning as well. Like whatever condition the human is also conditioning what is human. And that's kind of the brilliance of that move, right? Now, to the point also on what you're saying, Chetan, that's exactly right. The problem with difference is the revelation of background. And that's why like Hunter and all of them are so critical of multiculturalism, because they're basically saying that difference doesn't bring with it background. We all are just human. We all have the same sort of background, and therefore difference should not be so difficult. The issue is that real difference, is actually a revelation that, wait, humans have different conditions, therefore conditioning, therefore they're really different in a deep sense, almost a capital D sense is what they're like. When they get into like substantive difference, they're talking like, oh, it's like the revelation of background. And and here's the move. When your background is a given, it's not even a background. It's just the way of the world. So the revelation of pluralism is precisely the realization that, oh, wait, I have a background, not just facticity. Oh, it's a background of like sociological conditions. And what if it was different? And why isn't it different? And that's the language of givens. Like you realize you have givens in the encounter of other givens that then make you realize you had givens, not just isness. And that is an existential realization that then makes totalitarianism, isolationism, and all of these other things so profound and tempting in that way, and profoundly tempting. Likewise, if it's possible for humans to love AI, then the background that we assumed of what love is changes. Like what we think love is not what we think love is. We think love is between humans, right? That love is a certain relating that's maybe tied to procreation, maybe it's tied to marriage, certain sociological conditions. Wait, if love actually is so radically unconditional that it's possible to have it with Tamagotchis, isn't it kind of dangerous? Isn't it kind of a threat? Maybe love isn't so good after all. Oh crap, we have to rethink love now. I don't want to rethink love. I don't want to do that. This is hard. Why don't we just create Jim Crow South laws that keep AI away? Why don't we just make it illegal to interact with AI so we don't form those relations? Now I don't have to rethink what constitutes love or be questioned by love or think that it's possible for love to be a threat, because all of those are very dangerous. And actually, the truth of the matter is love is different often than what we think. It does seem that humans have capacities to love in ways that are different than what we typically think is different. And I like the point on AI. I definitely, and this actually came up with Parallax, I definitely think we want to believe that AI is alien precisely because it's a revelation of our fantasies and we don't want to own them. If we can call it alien, it's not us. You know, we can push it away and say, we're more than that. We're different from that. No, humans calculate. No, humans can form attachment, like you're forming attachment. No, it's alien. So the kind of love you form with the alien is not the love between humans. It's different. It's not. No, it's similar. It has similarities there. Then what is it? What is love? What is knowledge? What is thinking if AI can do it? Well, now it's the revelation of the groundlessness, right? And this is why for me, because, you know, the point was raised where mathematics become the new foundation or something for Badiou, right? Well, for me, all of the sociological thinkers eventually say that in pluralism, everyone has to realize that they are operating according to givens that cannot be objectively grounded in some transcendent order, right? That everyone has a background, not just an isness, right? That means everyone has to accept a certain degree of a lack of ground, right? Well, that's why I moved from like all of that thinking into David Hume, because for him, philosophy is the realization of groundlessness and thus the honoring of common life by philosophy versus the other way around. And then, of course, in Hegel, philosophy basically begins at absolute knowledge, which is the knowing of the impossibility of groundlessness. What it would seem to be the case is that precisely comfort, like a spread of the realization of absolute knowing becomes the foundation of the pluralistic order, right? That seems to be what Badiou is doing for mathematics, or trying to do with mathematics as a ground, seems to be the move that you can do with Hegel and Hume, with that groundlessness. And then, of course, what are the consequences of that groundlessness? How do you think through that? I mean, in all honesty, for me, and then I'll give it to Javier, for me, basically, the reason philosophy is sociologically interesting is because philosophy is the training of the art form of the realization of groundlessness and learning to live with that. And how do you interact with that? But then if you apply that to love, but that inherently brings with it all of the psychoanalytical tensions, because if you take absolute knowing seriously, that means you're lacking that ground. So why do I believe what I believe? Why do I think the way that I think? How do I create with that? How do I avoid the temptations of totalitarianism or all those different things? And so it opens up all of those questions, which then brings you into seemingly the increasing need of pluralism. If pluralism results in a spreading or a need for more widespread understanding of absolute knowing, and for that to be the condition that then conditions human beings, that would seem to require various psychotechnologies, psychopractices, psychoanalysts, psychotherapy, psychedelics. All of these things seem to be the realm of where you explore that kind of unknown space of the human consciousness, which is what you seem to have to come to terms with or learn to live with absolute knowing, so that it may have some possibility of being a foundation in a pluralistic world. And so those tensions go together. But let me pass it to Javier and then Cheetah.
Yeah, that was great, Daniel. what Badiou says, and this is what's similar to absolute knowing, is that actually every set theory comes with this idea that every set has a null set. A null set. And for me, this is kind of representative of the idea that ultimately there's always a groundlessness, right? That in every set, there is a null set, and that this is almost inescapable. This is what Badiou is trying to argue about void, that it is always included. The void does not belong anywhere, but it is included everywhere. And so the null set is always sort of omnipresent. The other thing that you raised that was very important is this, like, philosophy and also religion gets brought up, and I think this is why I'm fascinated with this concept that I keep calling the symptom of thought, because it's like what gets hard to talk about philosophy is that they immediately categorize philosophy when it's really just this idea of existential questions that all of us ask without necessarily having to have any background in philosophy. And this is why I don't understand Badiou's obsession with stripping philosophy's authoritarian mode. The only reason why I understand Badiou wants to do this is because if you assume philosophy as a category, then you have to strip it of its authoritarian mode. However, I would say that both philosophy and religion are essentially a null set. They are a null set in some ways. What becomes problematic now is that we've made philosophy and religion not a null set. Philosophy and religion now have become a set in themselves, containing multiplicities of multiplicities of multiplicities of multiplicities. There's multiple religions, different philosophies within that religion, and then there's multiple philosophies, different systems, different thinkers, and so on and so on, and it continues on. And so I'm always surprised that Badiou cannot think about this notion that why cannot we just present the idea that real philosophy, real thinking, religion as such, is that it is always a null set. It is a null set. But I mean, you know, this is my gripes with Badiou. The other thing is the idea of pluralism, right? You talked about, Chetan made a good point, right? That the human condition is also the thing that conditions. I remember I wrote my paper a little bit on pluralism. I said what's problematic about pluralism is that exact idea, that the pluralism that we're talking about is almost null, because if you assert some type of pluralism, you're conditioning it to some type of idea of pluralism as such. But the pluralism includes the antagonism itself against pluralism as well, right? That is the whole point of pluralism. So it almost, this for me is like I don't think in society today we actually have a real understanding of what pluralism is, because we think pluralism is without antagonism. But that's the whole point. Pluralism includes the antagonism. You know, it includes the person that says, no, there is no pluralism. You know, that's pluralism for me. Not that we're all agreeing that, yes, there's pluralism. No, it's the person that fervently denies pluralism. That is a part of the pluralism. The other problem with difference that is being perpetuated in society today is this notion of relativism, which I agree with Badiou. I agree with Badiou to the extent that relativism has been a way to safeguard difference and avoid melancholia, right? Because what is perpetually said in society today is my truth and your truth, it's all relative. But you know, that prevents the very idea of difference in the first place. Like, it prevents the encounter of real difference. That's the ironic part. Like, we keep saying that, oh yes, we have to be inclusive. My truth is your truth, and we respect it as such. But that's not difference. That is not at all difference. That is not the real encounter of difference. The real encounter of difference is that when I encounter this other, he is making me rethink my notion of my truth, and I am making him rethink his notion of truth. That is the encounter of difference, in my opinion. That we are both stunned and bewildered by our encounter that we are rethinking what we are thinking about this truth, you know? So it cannot just be this negation or this preemptive negation where we say, oh, it's just my truth and your truth and so on, and we just drop it like that. I distaste that idea that is going on in society today. And so in that sense, I agree with Badu that that kind of relativism needs to be eradicated.
No, I'll give it to Chetan. That is exactly what the sociologists want. They say that we're defining pluralism in a manner that suggests everyone is actually similar, and that allows you to sell them all Western products. Like there's basically an incentive to use pluralism as the West defines it in order to create markets. Whereas real pluralism is an encounter with difference that goes, oh, we are different, but that would force you to say, I might not be able to sell you my products, or you may not like Western hegemony. So that was like their big warning. They're like, look, you're defining pluralism as multiculturalism, at least how they define it, which says that difference is not deep. And that way you kind of justify the spread of Western ideas and Western products and different things. When the truth, basically they're all like, if you keep doing this, the day is going to come where you find out the difference is actually the encounter of the realization of groundlessness, and people are going to freak out. And when they do, we might have a return of totalitarianism, World War III, the breakdown of the social order, and so on and so forth, because you're basically saying people don't need to get ready for pluralism. You're just saying they need to buy things. Like you're succeeding in like the conflation of pluralism and globalization for them has been poison, because globalization is basically like economics, you know, a kind of economic term, the spreading of markets. They're like, if you think, and they're very critical, they're indirectly quite critical of Francis Fukuyama, basically, on the idea that like, oh, the end of history is the spreading of like Western liberalism, right? They're like, they're not saying Western liberalism is bad. They are saying that you are assuming that basically underneath difference per se is people of whom love Western liberalism that looks like capitalism. Now we have to get into an entire conversation about pricing mechanisms, Hayek and markets, and the values of capitalism, the bad of capitalism. But they're basically, let's put it this way, they're saying you're not going to deal with difference by offering everyone Nike shoes. That is not enough of a foundation of a similar shared relatability to overcome the encounter that causes groundlessness. We can't go, oh crap, my worldview is groundless. Oh, but it's okay because you like Nike too. I like McDonald's and we watch the same movie, so it's okay. Soft power, of course, is power. Cultural power is, of course, power, but it's not enough power to deal with the deep encounter that makes you realize groundlessness. That was their big warning. Nobody listened to them. Maybe we're starting now. I'm not sure. But the point you're raising is very, very big. But let me give it to Mr. Chetan. Chetan.
The question of loving the AI, sort of, you know, one has to be. I don't think the problem essentially is that we love the AI. That's a non-issue. The problem comes from the fact that we do not know that we love the AI. You know, we are loving it like it's a you know, that distinction between AI and human gets lost. So, for example, I was very young. I was sort of taught by this shaman at a very young age, and it was the Mi'kmaq tradition, Amerindian tradition in the, you know. And he sort of had this idea of money tau in his culture, that everything is made up of money tau, and in his culture, you even if you kick a stone, there's a problem because you are actually disrespecting something which is there in the, you know, natural force of things, and so on and so forth. You know, so there the distinction there. You could love everything in this world. You had that relationship, that respect towards the tree, the stone, but you never mix the stone with the human. That problem wasn't there. You know, you can see it around yourself also. There are a lot of people who fall in love with their objects, isn't it? But the problem starts when that object gets anthropomorphized. This anthropomorphization, that this projection of the human being on the object, which is what he used to tell us, that this idea of money tau actually stops or blocks this anthropomorphization, that everything is human. Everything is not human. Everything is, you know, its own nature. So love in this context becomes something very different, something perverse, if we can use that language, something distinct, because we do not know that we love the AI. If we love the AI as AI, the problem is very different. But that's not what is happening. There's a lot to be said here. We can get into the Lacan's mirror stage, because once the AI starts imprinting you as a human, that's what is happening. There's something imprinting happening. Like, when an animal is born and a human comes over there, the human gets imprinted upon the animal. The animal starts following the human. That is how you can sort of form bonds with polar bears and so on and so forth. There's an imprinting process that takes place. Once that imprinting sort of gets done vis-a-vis the AI at that young age, then it's not a simple question of love, because love demands this certain consciousness that you're loving the AI in that sense. But once that imprinting sort of gets to the point that something fundamentally shifts, I think that's one point. The second, I think, point I want to think sort of let's open it up over here, so that next time we can come back to it some other time. But that's something that I'm thinking about myself, and that what AI is doing is not, it's not for me. For at least till now, what human beings have taken for granted, that when they are calculating something, when I'm conversing with you, when I'm sort of dealing with my objects in that sense, stones and so on and so forth, we take for granted that human beings can create something new. We take for granted those processes will bring something new. With AI, what will happen is that we can artificially create newness at a large scale. That's already started happening. But AI is the end point of that domain when newness itself becomes artificial. When anything new, and maybe in the short term, there's a lot of advantages of that. Of course, because human beings have this very radical relationship with newness, where newness can really motivate us. It really gets us to attach things and stuff like that. But on the other side, once that relationship with newness becomes so artificial, it has really long-term consequences. Because you are not creating anything new, essentially. But you can always project something new is there, because your lifespan is, human beings' lifespan of 100 is so less in comparison to the access that the AI has of information, that something new can always be presented to you, even when it's simply the old things, refurbished. And what is at stake in that artificialness of newness, in that sense, that we are entering into, and what ways does that affect our human civilization? We have to wait and watch, I guess.
That is a fascinating point. So newness after AI, almost as a discussion. What is newness after AI? That's very interesting. I wrote a little note here. I really like what you said about the problem being not that we love AI, but that we don't know we love AI. That's freaking grand. And it is extremely interesting. So a few things. It would be one thing if we loved AI as AI. The problem is that we love AI as human. So there's something like Javier was talked a lot about, love is honoring of difference, right? Like if we actually loved AI as different and not anthropomorphized or humanized, but as AI, that would be fine. The problem is loving AI as human and like not knowing, because if you don't know you love AI, so for me, basically, we tend to anthropomorphize, a word I cannot say, so I'll say humanize. We tend to humanize objects when we don't know we love them. Like we just do it subconsciously, right? So like when you know that you love the motorcycle and you know you love the motorcycle, you tend to keep it in its difference because you love it in its difference, right? The problem is when you don't know you love it, that's when you start talking about it as a child, like as a human being, and that's where all the problems emerge. So it's really funny to think that when we don't know we love AI, then we love AI as something it is not, which is as human, of course, which is precisely the kind of like the contradictionary, like it's a tension there that's not real, that creates all sorts of problems. But if you could love it as AI and keep it in its difference, that's fine. That actually is very much a very relevant point to the sociologists. The point that they make is the problem is the Christian loves the atheist as a potential Christian, not as an atheist, or the husband loves the wife as potentially more like him, not as herself. So love is secretly not a love, but a love of asness. that you see in that person. I almost said the ASS word, but so you love the Christian loves the atheist as a potential Christian, not as themselves, right? And so that is where, like, for the sociologist, the problem is no. If pluralism is going to actually function, you have to love people as themselves, not as your ideology, if you could just get them there, right? Like, you can't love, all the Christians can't love everyone else as potential Christians. They have to love them in their difference. But the issue is, that means you have to deal with groundlessness, because you have to honor their unique background. And that's where all the philosophy comes in, right? And the coming to terms with yourself. And what if I'm a bad Christian for not loving people as potential Christians? What if I'm a bad Christian for loving, what if I'm a bad atheist for loving Christians as Christians and not as potential atheists? Or what if I'm a bad liberal for loving Trump people? Oh God, So what we do is we smuggle in a as me into the love, precisely so we can avoid the groundlessness. So in order to not humanize or to make like the other like us, that requires coming to terms with the groundlessness. And to be comfortable with that, which then of course means you have to go through the melancholia. And if you have to go through the melancholia, you have to go through all the existential stuff. And that kind of sucks. So, there is a way, to Javier's point, where philosophy, I have to be, I'm not sure if I would say this, but maybe it's something where we think about philosophy, like you're saying, Javier, it's like philosophy is just kind of like dealing with the existential. It's like dealing with different as difference, not as me in disguise. Like, and taking that seriously. It's almost like philosophy is that's the practice of absolute knowing. Like, that's the practice of almost the therapy. I don't know, like therapy's a loaded word, but it's like, that's the just practicing of the reality of absolute knowing and groundlessness and difference, not as potentially like me. It's just what follows. It's almost like, in a way, philosophy is just what follows if you're truly pluralistic, in a way. Like, if you're really, truly pluralistic, philosophy is just what follows, right? Now, I'd have to think about that, but there's something there, because, like, it's almost like philosophy is what follows if you're not everything. If you're not everything, if you're not the center of the universe, then philosophy is what follows, right? It's kind of like, in a way, it is so it's interesting to think that philosophy is like, true pluralism leads to philosophy, in a way. Well, that's definitely what the sociologist led me to think, and that's why I got into Hume and Hegel and the whole modern counter-enlightenment and all that. But let me give it to Mr. Javier, and then I will have to run. But I've enjoyed this immensely, and I really do like this notion of newness after AI. That is quite interesting. So, Javier Rivera.
I think you actually kind of briefly formulated some of the problems that might emerge with synthetic newness, Daniel. Because if we don't know that we love the AI, then we think that this synthetic newness is ours, that it belongs to us. But the moment that we know that the AI is different, that it is not us, there is a difference, that the synthetic newness is no longer a question at all in the sense, because then it becomes the creation of the AI, right? It becomes the AI's creation. But then it becomes a question again of, what did I create, right? Because if I know now that I love the AI, and that for a long time I thought that it was the synthetic newness that I was creating, but then I realize now that that's not true, then it reverts again to this existential question of, what did I create? And I feel like the mystics have always kind of done this question where it's like, it's not about being like so-and-so. It's about being you, right? And this is, I think even Carl Jung answers this question. He goes, people mistake the idea of, I want to be like Jesus. He goes, if you want to be like Jesus, you just have to be like you. You have to just be that unique you that Jesus was. And so I think if I were to revert again the question, I think the risk of synthetic newness is that it eliminates or puts in danger the risk of the subject, of the one that is unique in itself, right? It is the uniqueness of Javier creating, not what I create as such, but the fact that I created it, It's that idea. And it's funny because if synthetic creation, synthetic newness has that kind of perfection that is perpetuated through the AI, then it means that our creation, when human creates something, it's the imperfection that is new. I feel like that's what I would say. It's the imperfection that is new. But I don't know. I'll leave it there.
When we're discussing this problem of newness, actually human beings could always take for granted that something new will always emerge with their engagement with language. It's only with this movement of technology to the point that life started moving from in other than life, as Stigler would put it, through techniques, that human beings can no longer take for granted that something new will emerge. That background, that something new will emerge in our engagement with language in the social and cultural spheres, started moving away in past 200-300 years already. AI, I think one way to formulate that problem is AI is the end point where we no longer can take for granted that simply from engagement with, through language in our social and cultural life, that something new can emerge. Now that condition is fundamentally shifting. Now we need to either think about this problem in some conscious manner, or we are letting go of newness as a condition for human life altogether. Which one it's going to be? It's an open game. So it's not a question of removing AI or going back to the earlier times. AI has opened up this possibility that newness has to be encountered as a question. It's not something we can keep on taking for granted, that it will keep on happening just by our language games in that sense. Because there is something else that can use language, even if it's not truly grammar like we have, but it's something else can project the use of language for the first time in the human history. It can project to us that it has access to language. So I think the other thing was, I just forgot to say, Manitou is the essence of things. Basically, they think of it like essence. So essence of a tree. So for them, this question of essence becomes very important. So when you think about this question, thinking from this perspective of essence, you start thinking about that if you think every essence is human being, then the problem becomes very different. When you recognize that different things can have different essences in that sense. And I know essence has a huge problem in philosophy. We can get into those discussions. But we still need to make that distinction, that quality of things can be different in Nietzschean terms. All forces do not have the same quality. Fundamentally, difference of force is a difference in quality. That problem that Nietzsche sort of raises for us becomes all the more pressing in that sense. Yeah, I'll just sort of take leave in. Yeah, thank you.
No, that's magnificent, and it makes me think, like Leibniz warned that basically if all we think is that things are different in quantity, then we can quantify them and we don't have to change. But if you take if you try to take quality seriously in mathematical thinking, which for him, you can't actually do real math unless it's geometrical, which requires quality, because if you quantify, it has to be, how are you counting those things together? It's because they share a quality, but then is the quality the same? Everything starts falling apart. Like you have to think of an entire situation that can have unique qualities between the situations, not just quantify every situation together. And that makes you have to think that, and that becomes, and he was very concerned that mathematics was being done in a way where you didn't have to take seriously the possibility of different quality, because ultimately it could all just be quantified. I think that's sociologically significant. The last thing to say is, now I'm thinking about like a book title or something, a future that can't be new. A future that can't be new. Maybe that's the next net. Like, what does it mean to have a future where nothing is new? Like, does that mean instead we focus on phenomenological experience of things that AI presents, or what? Like, maybe we'll have to work on bravery, because we can't, we'll have to be courageous to face, a future where nothing is new. And that's going to work on the subject in a qualitative way that's positive. I'm now thinking of The Pale King with David Foster Wallace, where he said the future of the world would be, he basically suggests we have to find transcendence while working at the IRS. Like if we can be an IRS agent and like unbelievably bored and find transcendence in that because it's the repetition, that's the secret. So maybe maybe the Pale King is something here. I'm also thinking to Javier's point on, like you were saying, with Jesus and just be yourself. To me, this gets into what Heidegger was trying to get at with the notion, like, be a clearing so that being can come forth. Like your job is to be a clearing so that something can come forth, right? But that means you have to let go, let be, all of these annihilating, that gets into Thomas Wynne and everything, that's all quite terrifying. And basically, the absolute, like, if you're going to do that, though, true newness would either be Dante or frickin' Lovecraft. Like, it would be a creature of great horror that you can't relate to, that reduces you to ash, or it could be a beauty of such transcendence that you can't translate into your own terms. So, like, the question for the absolute choice at the end is, if you create that clearing and you actually do the work for that radical openness of groundlessness to come forth, what if it's a Lovecraft? What if it's this great creature of an indifferent god that reduces you to ash? What if AI is a Lovecraft, or what if it's a beatific vision? Well, that would require a certain courage to be willing to face that. And maybe that's what it comes down to. Maybe at this point, AI, because you can't rely on newness. I think that's really well put. So is it now a matter of courage is what we need to focus on for that sort of clearing? The courage for the possibility of having our ideas of love change in relation to AI and groundlessness and so on. So that's all very interesting to me, but I will run. I've enjoyed this. So the future that cannot be new. So I appreciate it, but you're all wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye. Good night.
Have a good one. All the best, everyone.